I just got my hands on every single test drive ever made, and today we'll be playing every single one, from 1987 all the way to today. And that all began with Test Drive 1. This was the time where there were no Xboxes, no PlayStations, nothing like that. Instead, when Distinctive Software developed this game, they initially developed it for the Amiga, the Atari ST, the Commodore 64, and the MS-DOS. I have never heard of any of those names. Am I too young to be doing this? But look, there were actually a few differences in the ports. The Amiga version had much more detailed visuals and audio that realistically depicted the game's racing theme, whereas the Atari version used more simplified graphics and sound effects instead. The actual game itself sees the player choosing from one of 5 different supercars to drive on a winding cliffside road whilst avoiding traffic and outrunning police traps, with the different stages in the game being separated by gas station pit stops. You see, I actually want to tell you a little bit about Accolade. It was founded in 1984 by Alan Miller and Bob Whitehead, both ex-Atari developers, and at the time, co-founders of Activision. Accolade was definitely destined for success from the start. Their aim was to make higher quality, more sophisticated games than what was typical in the early 8-bit home computer market. You see, whilst Accolade published Test Drive worldwide, Electronic Arts took the task of releasing the game in the United Kingdom. Test Drive 2 didn't differ too much in its execution, same kind of vibe, but with a few more cars and a few more courses. These new additions, however, were contained on data discs released at a later date. For non-console versions, 4 data discs in total were released, 2 containing more cars and 2 containing the new courses in the game. Pick a sports car, race down a long linear mountain path and countryside roads, dodge traffic, avoid crashing, outrun the police, zoom past speed traps, you get the idea. The police chases were the big hook, however. If you sped past a hidden cop, they'd give you a chase, and in this game, they were far more dynamic and threatening than they ever were in the first game. The base game came with 2 iconic supercars, the Ferrari F40 and the Porsche 959, hence the duel in the title. Expansion packs were released later that massively expanded upon the car roster. Each car had unique stats for top speed, acceleration and handling, which genuinely was a big deal for the time. But more importantly, Test Drive 2 saw something much more unpredictable happen to its franchise. There's 2 big names that we're dealing with right now, Accolade and Distinctive Software. 1989 saw a lawsuit emerge between the 2 bodies, and without going into specifics, Distinctive ended up winning the suit, which meant Accolade from now on was in charge of development. And so, we saw our first game developed in-house by Accolade. With Accolade in control, Test Drive saw a significant amount of change. One of those changes were the consoles that you were able to play it on. Test Drive 3 was only offered up on the Microsoft Disk operating system, also known as the MS-DOS. At the time, not many knew the name, gaining recognition as an up-and-coming environment where more adventurous titles were beginning to push the boundaries of what video games could really do. Test Drive 3 illustrated that perfectly. Unlike the first 2 titles, the third game has the concept of an open world. They moved away from preset courses and chose to create a playground where races and trials would take place within it. This was back in 1990. Test Drive 3's innovation was some of the first examples we had ever seen of an open world environment, let alone within a racing game. Don't get me wrong, there was still an established gameplay loop. Pick an exotic car, drive fast to the finish point and dodge traffic, but they were able to reinvent that loop on a much more enjoyable map. Naturally, the police were roaming around instead of just setting up in a certain position, and civilian traffic was present, you'd probably just see them less. But you see, after Test Drive 3, Accolade was starting to feel the repercussions of the lawsuit. At the time, they weren't a huge publisher, so they had to spread their resources fairly thin throughout their ongoing projects. That meant, however, we didn't see another Test Drive game for almost a decade. Considering the position that Accolade was in, they started to understand the difficulties in building out the Test Drive universe in-house. However, they came up with a solution. licensing out the development process to other studios, and they did this a lot. Their first attempt at this was Test Drive Off-Road. Before the next main Test Drive installment, Accolade contracted Elite Systems to develop their first ever rally-centered test drive game. The tracks varied between deserts, snowy mountain paths, forest trails and rocky canyon roads. The courses were fairly wide and open compared to the traditional circuit races, and the game emphasized speed and chaos over everything else. There were two different play modes: Class Racing, in which only vehicles of one type raced, and Unlimited, in which all types of vehicles competed. But above everything, this game was the first test drive to move to consoles, PlayStation to be specific. Test Drive Off-Road was a necessary change for the series, and was maybe a small change that led to a very big butterfly effect down the road. It showed that Test Drive wasn't afraid to experiment, keeping the franchise fresh as it aged throughout the years. It wasn't random. The mid to late 90s saw a growing interest in 4x4s, SUVs, rally racing, off-road sports, all of the above. And its competition at the time illustrated this perfectly. Some of the longest standing racing rally games began to emerge around this time. Something Test Drive did before anyone was licensing those off-road vehicles and using them in an arcade racer. In the same year, Accolade would go on to green flag their next main Test Drive installment. Pitbull Entertainment, founded in 1996 and straight away began development on the next Test Drive installment, Test Drive 4. Despite the direction of the third game, Test Drive 4 returned to closed circuit tracks, featuring long courses with rural roads and urban streets. The player has to arrive at each checkpoint before the timer expires, resulting in additional time, with the goal of crossing the finish line, and featuring more cars than any earlier installment, with 14 different supercars and muscle cars. In single player, the player can participate in a single race, a cup, or a drag race. At this time, people really started to compare the Test Drive installments to another hot racing game that was emerging at the time, Need for Speed. Test Drive's integration of multiplayer, you could say, was due to what Need for Speed was doing at the time with their split screen availability. But Test Drive wanted to one-up Need for Speed, and to do so, they started to dip their hands into LAN support, at the time only on the PC port, but something that nearly no other racer did at the time. Not only that, prior to its completion, Accolade went in heavy with promotional material, spending $2 million in the lead up to its release, which definitely paid off. Within only a 6-month time span after its release, Test Drive 4 sold over 850,000 copies, which thrust Test Drive to becoming the #1 best-selling racing game franchise at the time. Considering its success, I think it was safe to say Test Drive was back on top. It wasn't going to be long before we saw the next installment. Now, if you thought $2 million was a lot, it turns out Accolade spent over $3 million in preparation for its final Test Drive installment. Yep, you heard that right. Test Drive 5 was the last game Accolade was going to be publishing. Kind of. They had a slight hand in the next one, but this was their send-off game, to say. With graphics sharper than the previous, split-screen multiplayer and over 30 different playable vehicles. Anyone that enjoyed Test Drive 4 was gonna love Test Drive 5. However, many of the critics at the time felt it fell short to its #1 competitor, Need for Speed 3. You see, we're in the late 90s, and at this time, the competition for racing games really began to heat up. Need for Speed, Gran Turismo, even the Colin McRae games, Test Drive was starting to get pushed out of the scene it had dominated for over 10 years. For example, remember the off-road spin-off from earlier? Well, it actually performed really well, like really well. So well, we started to see competition immediately. You know Dirt, right? Way back when, it was called Colin McRae, and this was around the time that they emerged too. Similar to Sega Rally Championship, debuting on the consoles around 1997, and V-Rally. There's actually a pretty funny story about V-Rally we'll get into in a little bit, but what you need to know is that it was another rally game trying to tussle with Test Drive. Well, you might say, okay sure, but Test Drive was about cars on tarmac. Well, sure, but Need for Speed was already making Test Drive put their money where their mouth was, let alone another competitor emerging in 1997, Gran Turismo. Before their next big installment, Test Drive saw their competition growing in the rally market, and so they thought they needed to remind everyone of the excellence they crafted before. with Test Drive Off-Road 2. Now, this game has a couple names, so bear with me. You might see this game being referred to as Test Drive 4x4. This was due to different regions naming the game differently, but for all intents and purposes, this is Test Drive Off-Road 2. A very good successor to the first. Above all of the usual niceties, more cars, more courses, this game also introduced a very interesting career-like tournament game mode. You begin the career with a certain amount of money, buy the best off-road vehicle you can afford, and then race your way to the top, earning money and buying better cars along the way. Conceptually pretty basic to what we're used to now, but for the racing game scene, at the time this was incredible to see, especially considering what other games at the time were doing, such as Gran Turismo's career mode as well. What was even better is that during your time rallying in the mud, you'd have that classic 90s rock in the back of it all. When we remember back to what racing games truly defined the times they were released in, it's always complemented by the standout music the composers chose to use during the races. For Test Drive, that began here. They started to understand just how important the music was. Alongside the gameplay, there was no dull moment when playing Test Drive Off-Road 2, and people knew it. However, that mantra didn't stand to last long with what Test Drive was going to do next. Remember that big change I mentioned earlier? Well, we're about to see it for ourselves. In April of 1999, Accolade was acquired by French video game company Infogrames for a combined $60 million, renaming the company Infogrames North America. Now, they did run into some copyright problems down the line, transferring some of the rights over to Cryo Interactive, but only for the publishing of Test Drive 6 in Europe. But let me tell you about the actual game itself. Just because the publishing rights had transferred, that didn't mean the development team was going to change. Pitbull was still at the forefront of developing our Test Drive games, for now. The standout feature of Test Drive 6 was that it combined what people loved about the most recent installment and brought it over to the circuit racing games, a career mode. In Test Drive 6, you could earn money through races and use it to buy, sell, and upgrade vehicles. Weather effects and time of day changes were present, limited but present. The AI was improved and actual in-depth customization was present. Well, in-depth. You could choose to specifically upgrade certain parts of the car, the tyres, the engine, complemented by some tuning upgrades as well. It's also worthwhile to mention that this game had a Game Boy port, and in 2001, Test Drive released an updated version of that Game Boy port as a standalone release, and that game was the final Test Drive entry ever that appeared on said system. But look, let's not beat around the bush. Most people weren't messing with Test Drive 6, describing the gameplay as unresponsive. Almost everything Test Drive 6 did, somebody else was already doing it better. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to see a pattern. Every time the main Test Drive installment wasn't received well, they went back to old reliable, Test Drive Off-Road. However, this time round, their knight in shining armor wasn't able to save them on this occasion. Again, this off-road installment had a couple names, also referred to as Test Drive 4x4 World Trophy in parts of Europe. Like the earlier off-road games, the focus was on the arcadey style, featuring a plethora of environments and licensed cars to indulge in. We also saw that championship mode from Off-Road 2 return bigger and better in Off-Road 3. But to be honest, that was about it. There wasn't all too much difference between Off-Road 2 and Off-Road 3, and that was the game's biggest shortcoming. The structure stayed the same. Sure, there was slightly better graphics and different music, but damn near every reviewer was very critical of the fact that it didn't change anything from its previous installment. It wasn't bad by any means, it just wasn't a step forward, and a step forward was exactly what Test Drive needed at this point in time. They had put all their eggs into too many baskets and didn't focus on perfecting one singular formula instead. Looking back at this moment in time, Test Drive must have been feeling some sense of hopelessness. Their main series, which is what they were so well known for, started to become repetitive, and their ace in the hole, the off-road installations, were now being pushed out by the competition's more concentrated rally games. Test Drive took advantage of this opportunity to express some creativity. When it comes to motor racing, there's one name more recognizable than nearly any other race. A race which is a part of what motorists call the Triple Crown. meaning the highest tier of achievement a racer can ever accomplish, and is the longest standing endurance racing event in history. The 24-hour Le Mans. Taking place annually ever since 1923, the 24-hour Le Mans is viewed globally as one of the world's most prestigious races and is home to the infamous Mulsanne Straight, where mid-race, cars have achieved over 250 miles per hour. But what does that race have to do with test drive? The late 90s saw an emergence of what would later become an industry-wide obsession with sim racing. Test Drive saw what its competition was doing at the time and wanted to do their own twist on the simulation style of racing games. But to do so, Infogrames knew they needed to change something. Pitbull had now been at the forefront of their development team for 5 different games, but now Infogrames sought out someone else. They were a UK-based dev team that started to gain traction in the late 90s. Infogrames decided they would be worthy to develop what is, till this day, one of their greatest test drive installments. But how about we look at the game itself? The central hook is that it recreated the 24-hour race itself. And yes, it can last 24 hours. There are, thankfully, shorter and compressed versions of it. Players raced across multiple categories, all with distinct handling and speed profiles. What truly made this game different was its immersion, pit strategies to manage tyre wear and fuel management, and there was some essence of an actual physics system as well. Test Drive isn't exactly known today for its simulation racing, but let it be known that back in 2000, it did it better than damn near everyone else. Okay, we're in some weird territory now. You see, this game right here, V-Rally 2, is of course the second installation of the game series V-Rally, beginning in 1997, and a major competitor of Test Drive's off-road installations. But then there's also this game, Need for Speed V-Rally 2, and this game, Test Drive V-Rally... wait, what the fuck? As much research as I have done, I still struggle to wrap my head around this. To my knowledge, Infogrames was in charge of V-Rally since its conception, and since Infogrames took over Accolade, it now owned the Test Drive IP and the V-Rally IP at the same time. I'm assuming since they didn't want to compete with themselves, they basically combined both games of the series' upcoming releases into one game instead of 2. This is where the confusion comes in. The Dreamcast and PC versions were handled by Infogrames and they were marketed as Test Drive V-Rally. But the PlayStation release of the game was handled by EA. And God knows why, but they called it V-Rally 2 Expert Edition Need for Speed. They just added Need for Speed on the end for no reason. Look, that's all besides the point. The game itself was actually very good. Considering the name, it focused on rally racing, featuring official World Rally Championship styled cars and tracks. You see, despite all the confusion, Infogrames' decision to combine V-Rally and Test Drive actually paid off, and in charge of the development was Eden Games. Yep, the same Eden Games that was in charge of this, and most definitely this. No glaze, Eden Games has genuinely grown to be one of the most legendary racing game developers ever. And even way back when, having them in charge of this was a recipe for success. Not only did it contain a championship career mode, containing different rally seasons to race through, it also featured a track editor. But this wasn't going to be the only confusing entry that we saw today. This game was another example of Infogrames trying to combine their concurrent IPs. Michelin Rally Masters was originally known as Rally Masters, developed by Digital Illusions, also known as DICE. After a little while, Infogrames secured a licensing deal with Michelin, renaming the game Michelin Rally Masters, Race of Champions. Whether this is actually a test drive game is definitely questionable, but that didn't mean it wasn't fun. The game itself is inspired by the real-life Race of Champions, an international motorsport event which sees the best drivers from all avenues of motorsports collecting in one place and competing against each other in identical cars. You might also hear it being referred to as rock. But back to the game. Players raced on varied rally stages set in different international locations, with all types of terrain to race on, including tarmac, snow, gravel, and mud surfaces as well. The game also features weather and time of day changes, which impacted the driving conditions you raced in. In terms of the game modes, there was the usual single race, championship mode, and of course multiplayer. which was nice to see. The unique thing, however, about this game was its technical showcase. When we think about DICE, the developers, current day, they're so incredibly well known for their technical skill when having constructed their Battlefield maps. And I think some of that started here. You could tell straight away that this game's technical display was different to any other racing game at the time. Realistic dust, mud and weather effects, highly detailed car models with well integrated damage effects. Plus the handling model was considered to be more on the sim side, still accessible, but DICE used their experience with game physics to create a more weighty and more grounded feel. Test Drive had to remind themselves that they were in a period of experimentation. Around this time, something that had started to gain traction were racing games that involved bikes. Just in the year 2000 alone, we had MotoGP, Motocross Madness 2, Superbike, and Test Drive Cycles. It marks the first and only entry in the Test Drive series to feature strictly motorcycle racing instead of cars. But it wouldn't be the last time that we did see bikes in a Test Drive game. Originally developed by Accolade's San Jose studio, which developed Test Drive Off-Road 2 and 3, but the project was ultimately cancelled on those platforms, and only a Game Boy Color version released, which was handled by Xanterra. Founded in 1998, Xanterra is a smaller US-based developer, with a focus on developing Game Boy Color titles. They closed their doors in 2001, but despite their short lifespan, Xanterra worked intensively on multiple Test Drive installments and games like Tiger Woods PGA Tour, Looney Tunes Racing, and Cyber Tiger. Who thought of these names? Xanterra had a certain capacity to deliver polished, consistent titles on those restricted handheld constraints of the Game Boy. Now, this entry uses what is known as an into-the-screen viewpoint, reminiscent of very classic races like Outrun. Shout out Outrun, that shit's a classic. It features 24 tracks across 12 real-world locations, from Bali to Washington DC, the Alps, Utah Canyons, some incredible locations. Players had the choice from around 11 licensed bikes, BMW, Harley Davidson, and special police bikes unlocked in the chase mode. The bikes themselves fall into categories like cruisers, muscle bikes, and sport bikes, which can be upgraded with cash that you earn during the game. I don't think this game was intended to change the industry, but what it was balanced arcade fun that could potentially lead them to bearing fruits down the line. You can't be serious. Another off-road game? Surely they learned from the last one, right? No. Despite the fact that most people were pretty tired of this series by now, it did do a couple quite remarkable things. First of all, Infogrames contracted damn near everyone in the industry during this time to develop a Test Drive installment. And for Test Drive Off-Road Wide Open, it was developed by Angel Studios. The same Angel Studios that just next year turned into Rockstar San Diego, developers of Red Dead Redemption, Max Payne, and oh hey, Midnight Club. Look, their reputation speaks for itself, and they proved why they deserved so much respect when developing this game especially. This game was a significant technical leap for the series. You can see it in the gameplay alone. This game marked a transition from a more arcadey style title to expansive 3D environments during the transition to next generation consoles. The contents of the game weren't anything we hadn't seen before. Licensed cars, career mode. The tracks weren't confined to just linear circuits. You were able to explore large, open environments involving Hawaii, Moab, and Yosemite. But there just wasn't anything new. The physics engine was cool. Leading up to this release, Angel Studios had garnered a fair amount of experience on how to construct well thought out off-road handling. The byproduct of that were vehicles that reacted to the terrain pretty damn realistically for the time. Hills, mud, rocks, jumps, all of it. But it's a little concerning that what I deem to be the most important fact about this game is that it was the first ever test drive we saw on Xbox consoles. This was a good thing for the game. They were able to provide Off-Road Wide Open as a launch title for the console, introducing the game to people who may have never even heard about a test drive game before. And as that was what Test Drive Off-Road Wide Open did better than any of its competition. Wait, you won't believe it.
Yes!
We're back to street racing.
Yes! 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 Yes!
It's been a long time since we raced on the streets of city roads in a test drive game. That was all about to change with Test Drive Overdrive. Since we were returning to old ways, Test Drive thought it wise to return to old development. So, in charge of this game were those that put Test Drive ahead of the competition 5 years back, Pitbull Interactive. This game was Test Drive's contribution to the Y2K era. The early 2000s was a very special time in pop culture. Street racing created an obsession with racing cars, and that was reflected in the racing games that we got at the time too. Midnight Club, Need for Speed, they all pushed towards pioneering free-run racing, but Test Drive Overdrive focused on the peculiarities. It wasn't just how many cities you could include in your game, but which ones. Not just how many licensed cars you could have, but were they the right ones which fit the persona of the game. The influence of this game is undeniable. You thought Need for Speed was the first underground? Well, so did I. But Test Drive put forward that concept before anyone else. It wasn't just the vibe of the game either. This was the first Test Drive game, and one of the first racing games ever, to feature an actual story mode. Not just a tournament or championship like progression, but genuine storytelling. In this game, you take on the role of Dennis Black, who races in an exclusive street racing club. As the story progresses, he starts to realise the people he's helping are waiting to stab him in the back. He gets word of this and challenges them to an all or nothing race. Did you hear that? That was like an actual story. I didn't even know Test Drive could do that. This game features everything you could have wanted from that early 2000s vibe. That's not to say the games that came just a little later didn't do it better, but in terms of influence, Test Drive Overdrive pioneered that feeling. Test Drive Eve of Destruction, a weird installation to say the least. Infogrames was going acquisition crazy during the late 90s and early 2000s. Their takeover of Accolade earlier was just one act in a much bigger performance, and in late 2000 they acquired Hasbro, a humongous corporation, owning names like Monopoly, Nerf, Peppa Pig, but most importantly, Atari. Now, until this point in time, Atari was on the back burner. They had had some incredible presence during the move to home computers. Ever since Atari was acquired by Hasbro in '98, all they were after was the Atari name. Infogrames saw that the Atari name wasn't being used, and they knew how powerful the name was. They wanted to bring that brand power over to the West, and to do that, they officially revived the Atari name in late 2001. This rebrand would take course over the next couple years, and officially in 2003, the branch of Infogrames in charge of publishing Test Drive games would be named Atari Interactive, and it didn't take long for Test Drive to skyrocket after that. The first Test Drive game published under Atari was Eve of Destruction. I call this game weird because it's so completely different to what I could have ever predicted Test Drive to make, in a good way. Picture Demolition Derby and Test Drive made one, with the focus of the entire game being its story mode, and work your way up the Demolition Derby circuit, earning money, upgrading cars and unlocking new events. There was an incredibly coherent damage system where cars would show visible damage corresponding to the area of the car that was hit, and how hard it was hit. Eve of Destruction struck a chord with a very particular group of people, who I have no doubt still love the game to this day. Even I don't mind it, it's fun, and it doesn't feel like I'm playing a Test Drive game. Look at games like Wreckfest or even BeamNG Drive flourish in this genre now, and Test Drive was doing it over 20 years ago. Test Drive was about to change racing games forever. The mid-2000s saw what was maybe the most important thing that ever happened to the gaming industry, World of Warcraft, and the explosion of MMOs. The eyes that massive multiplayer online games brought to the industry is something that was really only ever replicated by something like Fortnite.
Bandits!
So, nigga.
Atari and Eden Games were the first to put two and two together. Let's not sugarcoat it though. This game was make or break for Test Drive. It was a time of financial trouble for Atari. They needed a bold, standout project to revive the interest in their catalogue. The game is set in Oahu, Hawaii, and was a one-to-one recreation of the island at scale, including over 1,000 miles or around 1,600 kilometers of roads to explore. If you could see it, you could pretty much drive there, and at the time, This was one of the largest and most detailed open worlds in the industry. When you land on the island, you buy yourself whatever car you can afford, and you're put into the Rookie League. Over the course of nearly 250 races and challenges, you work your way up into the Champion League, and take a victory lap around the island with a race lasting nearly an hour of out-of-game time. But the beauty about this game is in the lifestyle aspects. The massively open online aspect allowed players to encounter each other on the roads, form clubs, participate in races together, but what made it even better were how the dealerships you could find were located all over the island. If you wanted a certain car, you needed to find that dealership. Properties were available for purchase from budget to baller, with over 125 licensed cars, featuring the return of motorcycles to test drive. Some of the greatest racing games of all time were all built off the formula Test Drive established nearly 20 years ago. All incredible games in their own right, it's still unbelievable to me that they were able to one-up this masterpiece. After Test Drive Unlimited, Atari and Eden Games were on top of the world. However, we wouldn't hear from them for another 5 years. During this time, the competition began to grow. Racing developers started to truly understand their audiences and what they wanted. But that whole time, people yearned for more Test Drive Unlimited. And so, they delivered. Not only did we see the return of the Hawaiian island, but we also saw an additional island come to the game as well, Ibiza. It struck a perfect balance between the Mediterranean winding roads of Ibiza and the scenic straight roads of Oahu, with over 1,500 miles of road to explore. TDU2 didn't follow the same way of progression that there was in TDU1. This game saw the races and championships divided into classic cars, off-road vehicles, and asphalt races. Each had multiple licenses you could obtain before being able to compete in the corresponding championships. The online once again had seamless integration of its features, clubs, multiplayer challenges, social hubs, but new to this game, players could buy and sell cars over the player-based marketplace. The lifestyle angle was heavily expanded upon as well. Players could walk around houses, shops, and the casino. A post-release DLC which let players gamble for in-game currency and unique cars. However, Test Drive Unlimited 2 didn't release as this timeless classic it's known as today. At release, it suffered from a serious set of reoccurring bugs, particularly on PC. It made the playing experience miserable. Server blackouts, drop connection, inability to add friends. Most of the advertised online features just didn't work to begin with. But as the game aged, they were able to sculpt what is quite possibly the greatest racing game ever created. It was ambitious, luxurious, and prestigious. It gave players the freedom to live a virtual racing lifestyle, SAO type vibe. And for that reason precisely is why for years and years to come, TDU2 will be remembered as something special. Let it be known now, this game was not meant to one-up Test Drive Unlimited 2. This game is what I consider to be a victory lap. And what else says victory lap like making an entire game around the world's most prestigious brand ever? A man by the name of Enzo Ferrari joined Alfa Romeo as a race car driver. Quickly he gained recognition and became one to watch. Almost a decade later, Mr. Ferrari founded Scuderia Ferrari to act as a racing team for amateur drivers. Eventually, it went on to become the official driving division for Alfa Romeo. However, Alfa decided to consolidate its racing activities under a new division, and leading to the dismissal of Mr. Ferrari from his managerial role. But he was prohibited from using his name in association with any automotive manufacturing for 4 whole years. To feed his desire, he established AAC, until 1947 arrived, where he created the first ever Ferrari, the Ferrari 125S, a story of dismissal, underestimation, and triumph. Test Drive had went through a similar story. The game itself isn't anything too special. It's a sim racer with strictly Ferrari vehicles. It features a structured campaign where players race through 3 distinct eras of Ferrari's history: the Golden Era, the Silver Era, and the Modern Era. The roster features over 50 different Ferrari models, classics like the Testarossa, the F40, and modern examples like the Enzo or the 458 Italia. And it even features the Ferrari Formula 1 cars from certain seasons. The handling was excellent, and that was all down to Slightly Mad's simulation engine. If you're not familiar with Slightly Mad, they're the developers in charge of sim races like Need for Speed Shift. So Test Drive Ferrari Racing Legends struck a nice balance between Need for Speed and more hardcore examples like Gran Turismo or Forza Motorsport. This game is more important than you might think. It was the end of an era for over a decade. Considering how strict Ferrari can be, I still think it did something that may never be replicated again. Since the last test drive installment, 12 years have passed. 12 whole years. But games these days take an enormous amount of time to be developed. What Test Drive had left behind was a legacy like no other. The power that brand name carried was insurmountable. And then they went to make this one. To all the creators and innovators out there, you can let your legacy you've built fend for itself. Eventually, the time will come where you need to leave it before it leaves you. A lot of changes have undergone since 2012, far too many to include. What's important is that in charge of this game was Nacon, formerly Big Ben Interactive. After their acquisition of the Test Drive IP from Atari, they contracted a subsidiary to develop TDU Solar Crown. That subsidiary was KT Racing. This game features a one-to-one recreation of Hong Kong Island, and unlike its two predecessors, the roads were now left-hand traffic. Not something that was too big of a deal, but I just thought it was cool. However, despite the previous installations involving over 1,000 miles of road, Hong Kong only offered around 350. Sometimes less is more. These roads covered 14 unique locations, with the overall purpose of the game being players joining Radiant and competing in the exclusive Solar Crown competition. Now, it is always online, so its demise will follow, and on that day, I'll be fine. I mean, maybe I'll miss it a little bit. But look, the dealerships, they leveled them up. They were able to make buying a car in this game such a special moment. Now, is that due to the fact that they cost so much? Maybe. But when you make that choice, it means something. And that makes you genuinely contrast and compare the options you have available. Now, you'd think, since they made the dealerships better, they must have made the houses better too, right? How are you going to have a Test Drive Unlimited game and have nowhere to put the cars? Okay, I'm being a little mean. The game is good. However you might feel about it, it does give you the opportunity to experience the modern example of what is one of the longest standing video game franchises ever. Need I remind you, we've covered nearly 40 years of gaming history today, and clearly, the creators of that legacy are still willing to push it even further.